I'm Robin Smith, president of the Cura Foundation, and on behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Jerusalem Ethics Forum, which is a joint initiative between the Galleon Foundation and the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, we want to welcome you to the third of a series of discussions around ethical dilemmas in healthcare. We're so fortunate that the need to rapidly create a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2 comes at a time when there's exponential progress in basic science research in genomics and structural biology that can support a new era in vaccine development. And over the past decades, the scientific community and pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries have been asked to respond urgently to epidemics such as H1N1 influenza, Ebola, Zika, and now SARS-CoV-2. And as a result of this, there are currently multiple platforms under development. Among those with the greatest potential for speed are DNA and RNA-based platforms, followed by those developing recombinant subunit vaccines. RNA and DNA vaccines can be made quickly since they don't require culturing or fermentation and instead use synthetic processes. This has contributed to the RNA vaccines for SARS-CoV-2 already entering into phase 2 and soon to be phase 3 clinical trials. While this is exciting, it's important to step back and recognize that with speed comes risk. So we're honored today to have with us two esteemed global research leaders to discuss ethical considerations of developing a vaccine for COVID-19. Dr. Michael Rosenblatt is a physician scientist who now serves as Chief Medical Officer of Flagship Pioneering in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a firm that originates new biotechnology companies. Previously, he served as Chief Medical Officer at Merck, Dean of Tufts University School of Medicine, and is the Robert Ebert Professor of Molecular Medicine and the George R. Minot Professor at Harvard Medical School. His esteemed career also includes serving as president of the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and director of the Harvard-MIT Division of Health Science and Technology. He will be joined by Moderna's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Tal Zaks, who oversees clinical development and regulatory affairs across Moderna, and who serves on the board of directors of Adaptimmune Therapeutics. Prior to joining Moderna, Dr. Zaks was Senior Vice President and Head of Global Oncology at Sanofi, where he was responsible for all aspects of oncology drug discovery, drug development, and commercialization. In addition to his industry work, Dr. Zaks is Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and has served as a volunteer physician at the Philadelphia Veterans Administration Medical Center, treating patients with genitourinary cancers. Before we begin, we'd like to frame the conversation and remind the audience that discussion should not be viewed as a vehicle to assess the advantages or disadvantages of Moderna's vaccine, or in any way through the discussion today be viewed to promote it. However, Moderna's vaccine efforts against COVID-19 will be discussed. We will have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to use the Zoom portal to write in questions to Dr. Rosenblatt and Dr. Zaks. Dr. Rosenblatt, I hand the mic over to you.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in the Jerusalem Ethics Forum, and we're grateful for the sponsorship of the Cura Foundation, Galleon Foundation, and the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. I'm also honored and very pleased to share the virtual podium with Tal Zaks, a colleague and friend, and looking forward to diving into some of the ethical issues and concerns and questions around the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. So let me turn to the questions now. And Tal, I'm going to ask a direct question, which is it's sort of the beginning of the whole process before we get into other things, which is how does a company like Moderna even make the decision to jump into this field? What are some of the factors that you considered, and what's some of the process? But while I give you a chance to think about that, I want to develop the question a little bit further, because I think there's a fair amount behind it. This virus has never been observed in the human population before. Moderna had ongoing programs that were well considered, that you decided to get into without a sense of urgency. The decision to initiate a vaccine program was made back in January, before I think anyone had a sense of the full dimension of this pandemic. And then, depending on what lens you look at this decision to jump in, you have shareholders and backers of the company who, of course, are expecting a certain commercial success and returns. And importantly, you also have ongoing programs that possibly, I don't know if it'll be true or not, may be delayed because of diversion of some effort. And of course, there were real patients waiting hopefully for the products of those programs. So it's a very complicated decision made without much data in the very beginning, and all sorts of implications that flow from it. So I've asked a long question. I'm going to give you a while to answer that question. Please, Tal.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Robin, for having me here as well. You ask a really good question, and it is one that it makes me think, because you're asking it in the context of an ethical panel. You know, I was fortunate to learn ethics as a medical student from Professor Vedvel Green, the late Professor Green, who was one of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life. And he taught me this concept that when you look at ethics, what you really are looking are moral values and the trade-offs. And so if you put it in that framework and you look at where we were in the very beginning of the year, as you rightly say, we had a number of programs ongoing. And the way that we had tried to prioritize our programs, or the opportunities we had, were sort of based on what we thought the value would be ultimately to the constituents that we serve. And you're right to point to the fact that we as a commercial entity have many constituents, and you named our stakeholders. But the interesting thing, I think, in the modern era of biotechnology, especially with a company that has such diverse products, is that there's a certain, I think, maturity in the field of understanding how to think about value in the context of developing medicines and vaccines. Now, it's not necessarily straightforward, but one of the interesting things, and you recall the late Henry Termeer, who was on our board, and Henry really pioneered the notion of medicines for rare genetic diseases. And this was something where for many years it was very difficult to envision how you can square away your ethical, moral responsibility to people with very rare diseases, so there are very few of them, and yet science has gotten us to the point where we can actually serve them. And your other stakeholders, those that invest and expect a return, etc. And Henry basically came up with a very simple and very powerful credo, which is to say, if you do what's right for the patient, the business will follow. And in the context of science being what it is in our era, I think that holds true for society at large. And it's sort of interesting because one of the things that I've learned in the past 6 months, so I'm a medical oncologist by training, and I used to think about developing medicines where I actually have a mental model of who the patient is I'm helping. I've seen those patients. Yet in vaccine developments, we actually don't have that mental model because we're developing a vaccine for healthy people, the vast majority of whom will likely not be helped. It's more of a population-based endeavor, and yet with tremendous benefit to society. So we have to weigh the value and the benefit, the moral obligation we have to translate our science to achieve that goal for society, and then step back and say, well, okay, how does this mesh with what we're trying to do as a company? Now, back in January, as you rightly point out, when this thing just started, it wasn't at all clear to us that in the location where we operate, United States is where we're domiciled with global ambitions for sure, but it wasn't clear to what degree we understand this virus and to what degree it is going to pose a threat. What was evident, though, from the first discussions at the executive team, and I can tell you that when we as executives get in the room together, it's not always an easy conversation because, as you say, there's not data and it isn't clear. And so from the get-go, there was a lot of internal debate. Well, how far should we invest whose resources to do this? And this is where I think in the context of a pandemic threat, actually you rely on government and support of others to represent that imperative that's coming from the population. And so I think one of the things that helped us early on was the relationship we had with the NIH and their interest in this. And there was always a feeling, I remember from the first meetings we had at the executive team, where we said, look, it's not clear that this will make commercial sense, but it is clear to us, crystal clear, that we actually have developed a technology that could address this. Therefore, we have an obligation to push this forward. And while we don't know the magnitude of the need just yet, and yes, we know the magnitude of the need for all those other applications that we're working on, but the potential that this risk could be as bad as it ultimately appears to be, that potential was evident. And I think that potential, combined with our sense of purpose of what we thought our science could translate into, is the reason that ultimately we decided from a very early stage to begin investing in this. Gingerly at first, to be sure, because we had to manage all those priorities, but very quickly, faster and faster, as the unquestionable need of society has emerged. And the last thing I sort of have to say is, and I appreciate Robin sort of laying the groundwork here. My lawyers would always have me have a forward-looking statement. This is meant to kind of give people a sense of where we are. We're not unique in this race, and I think there are other people who are facing similar challenges. I think our technology and our ability to move quickly have been somewhat unique, and so they've positioned us as in the forefront of this race. But I would tell everybody in the audience, there's an old Talmudic saying, I believe, that when the temple was lost, since then prophecy has been given to fools. And so that's a Talmudic explanation of the typical forward-looking statement. So to the degree I make any prophecies, I'm the fool. To the degree that you listen to anything I say, well, that's on you. With that caveat, though, I do think we have been able to move quite rapidly. And as the unmet need has become greater and greater, so have we and our government partners in the U.S. and elsewhere have begun to devote resources to making sure we can address that need.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glad that you highlighted that. I think some people tend to make the assumption that a commercial organization or a for-profit organization has kind of only one mission, and that's related to shareholder return, and clearly that's not the case. And also the point that you make about collaboration. We've been hearing about collaboration all over the medical scientific ecosystem in efforts to develop vaccines and therapies. I wanted now to dig down a little deeper into the actual development of the vaccine, the clinical trials. And of course, the purpose of clinical trials is to determine the safety and efficacy of a vaccine. Under normal, usual circumstances, we would want to get robust data in both of those categories. And that often means taking years because there's no shortcut, for instance, on the safety side. That depends on how many people you can look to for your database, and safety questions can persist beyond the acute injection for months or even years, and you can't answer them in less than months or years, depending on when you decide to go forward. So what's happened, of course, is that there are people who are speaking on the side of the longer we go, the more people will be harmed without a vaccine. So we have to be flexible. We have to move quickly, and it's not a conventional path forward. And then we have others who see great risk in moving forward more quickly and abandoning the conventional pathway for the development of a vaccine. So my question is, what, in your view, and I'm sure this is like one of the first things you've confronted, how do you think about development of a vaccine in terms of addressing safety and efficacy under these extraordinary circumstances?
Thank you, Mike. You point to a question that I think is very much right now in the public's debate and interest, and that is because this pandemic puts a very sharp lens on a problem or a challenge that is before us, which is to say, if the benefit of a vaccine is large, because we all see what the ravages of COVID-19 is, if we can prevent that, the benefit would be tremendous. Probably the biggest that I've seen in my professional career in terms of potential. So if the concept of developing a medicine and vaccine is to understand the benefit of the risk, and the benefit is very large, then I think it's a fair question to say, okay, well, then what risks are we willing to take? On the flip side, I think that question makes a lot of people very nervous for a very good reason, which is I've just said that we need to think of risk in relationship to benefit. In other words, risk is not an absolute. At some point in time, I will tell you this vaccine is 100% safe. I mean, you've got much more experience than me in this field, and you know that there is no such thing in a way. But it's always, let's get as much data as we can, let's understand the science, and then let's make an educated application. And by the way, this is where individuals have a right to disagree with what we say, because the choice to get vaccinated, and that's a whole other debate, right, between what, how much freedom an individual has and when does a government mandate vaccination. I think if you put that in the context with this conversation, you can understand why this is a topic that's raising a lot of questions in people's minds. Now, the truth is, I don't have a simple answer to that. Let me start from the science. We've been able to go very fast, and we have gone very fast, and we are continuing to move fast for two reasons. The first is, if you will, the push, the enablement of the scientific platform to actually go faster than ever we had before. We've got a platform, in this case it's an mRNA platform, that can just start with digital information and very quickly teach a body how to make the right protein so that our immune system can recognize the virus. That's why we've been able within a couple months to start clinical trials. And it's the same reason why we should be able to scale up commercially to have hundreds of millions of doses ready in a timeline that would have been unthinkable 3, 4, 5 years ago. So science has enabled us to move quickly and has propelled us, as has the scientific understanding of what is the right vaccine to develop here based on the cousins of this virus and based on work done by NIH and other academics. So science has propelled us forward on one hand. On the other hand, the unmet need has pulled us forward, right? We see people all the time getting infected. We understand the morbidity. We see hospitals straining. We all have lost people who we know or know of. And so it puts this speed element into focus. So how are we going to assess the benefit and the risk? I think the element for me as the chief medical officer in a commercial company is really to make sure that we develop the scientific basis for understanding the risk. In other words, for us, and we're going in hand with the US government to do a study in 30,000 participants that will start hopefully within a couple of weeks. And that trial will be able to show, because you're going to give half the people placebo and half the people vaccine, that trial will enable us to show, at least for the first few months, what is the side effect profile of this vaccine, and will enable us to understand the safety and tolerability. It's not going to be a long-term study for sure, because the disease is happening and we expect there to be enough cases that by the end of the year, we should be able to figure out whether this vaccine works, which means we will have data on a lot of people, but for a very short time. okay, is that enough safety data to go make the vaccine widely available? And the answer is, I don't know, and it's not my call in a way. It is ultimately going to be up to regulators and the people who speak on behalf of individuals, governments, to decide when is that benefit risk proposition crossed? When is it time to deploy the vaccine? And we're going to be depending on them to actually make that determination. It looks like my video is a little bit stuttering. I hope that people can still hear me.
We can hear you, Tal. Along those lines, though, I mean, this is a technology, as Robin pointed out, it's a technology that hasn't been on the planet before. And so are there special considerations, even in these circumstances, for applying a brand new technology that is likely, as you just said, is going to go into thousands of subjects in the trial and then many, many more afterwards?
So it's a good question, which is where I sort of rely on the fundamental tenets or the scientific tenets of how one develops a vaccine. So while the technology is new, as my colleague Stephen Hoag likes to say, it's not black magic. This is not a black box. We actually understand what we're doing. There's a reason why we can show antibodies and why we can demonstrate that the vaccine is immunogenic. We've done this before for other applications. We understand the immune system enough and what the virus is presenting to the immune system enough to do it. So, and then we're developing it in a traditional manner, although accelerated. So we have a phase 1 trial. We have a separate phase 2 trial. We will start a separate phase 3 trial. And each of these trials is collecting safety data the way we would normally do it. Now, the platform is new, so we've never dosed 30,000 people with this platform. That being said, what we've seen to date in the clinic is in complete concordance with what science has told us to expect. And so, yes, there's the unknown unknown. So there are risks of things I don't know. But to date, I don't have a scientific basis for concern or thinking that there is something here that should be unexpected and untoward. Things could happen. They could be a function of more people getting exposed to the components of the vaccine. They could be a function of the protein that the vaccine makes. In that case, we will see the shared side effect profile with other vaccines that are targeting the same protein. The fascinating thing for me is, the mRNA itself, that thing that encodes for our body how to make the protein, while we synthesize it in a lab, that's actually consists of nucleotides that every cell sees and chews up for food every hour of the day. So I don't expect anything surprising for the messenger RNA. So yes, it's new, but it's relying on evolution's experience with messenger RNA. The lipid nanoparticle, the delivery is new, and so we're going to be monitoring the safety. So far, we haven't seen anything unexpected. And to the degree that immunization doesn't achieve the goal, well, I think we will learn not just from our vaccine, but from what the other vaccines that are doing, that are trying to use writ large the same immunogen, that spike protein from the virus. That'll teach us about safety. But to go back to your broad question, I think the way we're developing this vaccine is to make sure that we are, while moving quickly, not skimping on the size of the trial or the depth of the safety follow-up for each individual, so that at the end of the day, we can describe the safety and reactogenicity profile of this vaccine.
Yeah. Great. Tal, you and I agreed that we would have a bit of a conversation as well, not just a kind of interview of asking you all questions. So I wanted to just say something about the terminology we use in medicine and in regulation. So we began with the regulators are looking for safety and efficacy, those categories. You and I, as physicians, we think about benefit risk, a term I use quite a bit. But here I tend to think about risk. So another way of looking at this is, what is the risk of the disease without an intervention, without a vaccine? What's the probability of getting complications of this disease in certain populations that have defined risk? versus the risk of the vaccine. And I think when you apply that kind of lens in addition to what you've spoken about, it will be possible, for instance, to say, well, depending on the performance of the vaccine, that it can go into populations with several different risk categories, and maybe it can't go to something else, or maybe it can go everywhere. But I think this concept of we're so focused on safety sometimes that we forget that the disease we're trying to prevent actually has risks and adverse experiences. So a couple of questions, maybe a little bit more quickly now. You've designed together with the NIH this huge 30,000 patient study. Of course, these phase 3 clinical trials are designed to give a sense of how a vaccine will perform across the various populations that the vaccine would eventually be made available to. So will there be older people in these trials? Will there be minority people in these trials who, as you know, are sharing a disproportionate burden of the disease? What's the complexion and composition of the large phase 3 trial?
Thanks, Mike. You raise an excellent point. I think we as an industry have traditionally not done a good enough job of representing minorities and people of special needs in clinical development. And I think in this one, especially in the current environment, it puts a spotlight on the need to do that. We are also, it's clear that the disease is impacting those populations more severely than others. And so when we look at our phase 3 trial, it is right to actually make sure that you are testing the vaccine in the people who are vulnerable. And it is right both for the societal ethical reason of these are the people who need it the most. And it is also right for a simple scientific principle, which is that you'll be able to get a more robust answer if you go to the people who are going to get sicker, because your trial will perform better, which actually leads to a very interesting observation. The science of it is not necessarily determined by the ethics. And here, there's a long history that I'm always particularly paying attention to as a chief medical officer, which is making sure that we ask the ethical question independent and on top of the pure scientific question. In fact, if you look at what an institutional review board often looks at, the composition of the trial doesn't usually, factor in. And yet we've just agreed that there is an ethical impairment to make sure that you have those underrepresented minorities. So to cut back to your question, we will have a defined population in the trial. I'll be able to speak to it more clearly in a week or two or so when we launch it. That will be people who are older. It will be people who have comorbid conditions. And the trial, by and large, from the get-go, is targeting we're trying to get people who are at high risk of infection to begin with. One of the reasons we're doing such a large trial is it enables us to work with a large, diverse set of communities and give the investigators within each of those communities the tool and the flexibility to determine within their local environment who is the most susceptible minority and people they should be reaching out with, and together with a national campaign, try and make sure that the opportunity to participate is open to all of those minorities. So it's something that is we take especially to heart with this vaccine and this trial, as do our partners at the NIH. So you'll see in the days to come sort of some of the concrete strategies that we're putting in place to make sure we achieve that goal.
So is this trial entirely U.S., or is there an opportunity to test in other geographies? And what about the developing world?
So this trial is going to be in the United States, really for two reasons. The first is we're still a relatively small company, and we're trying to do what we can, but it was quickest and fastest to get to an answer within the U.S. And the second reason is that, unfortunately, the U.S. is now at the forefront of infection rates. And so our ability to run a study here is as good or better than any place else. In fact, we looked at some European countries initially and then decided that the rates of infection there have gotten low to the point that it would make sense. You ask a question about the developing world. That is a challenging one to which it is hard for me to give you an answer. I cannot and will not run a trial in a country where I don't have a line of sight to how I will enable access. I think that is, unfair on basic principles. And so we're trying to figure out how we can eventually get access to the broader populations of the world. Right now, if you think about who defines access and who enables that, at the end of the day, it is governments taking care of their people. There are some supra-governmental bodies that are looking at this, namely the WHO and other similar bodies. The European Commission is trying to get a pan-European network. But so far from our bandwidth and capabilities, we are really trying to focus primarily on governments as the parties responsible for the determination for their people as to when and how and who should get it once it's available.
And then the last question that I wanted to ask you about before we open it up to Q&A from our listeners has to do, and you alluded to the speed. We're all feeling the urgency here, and I know how intensely you and your colleagues are working. And there's been a movement to consider conducting human challenge studies, and by that I mean vaccinating people with a potential vaccine and then challenging them with live virus to see if the vaccine will protect them. There have been over 25,000 volunteers actually formally signed up on the One Day Sooner website. So people are prepared to make this commitment. And the main reason they're doing it is to try to accelerate the development of the vaccine and get it available to the world. And I wonder what your thought. There are ethical questions, there are practical questions, but just quickly, what's your response and your thoughts about conducting a live virus challenge study?
So, Mike, on this one, I would actually, I'd punt the question back to you because I think you've got a broader experience, perhaps, than me. From my parochial perspective, at Moderna, when we looked at it, and I spoke to the gentleman who launched that website a few months ago, I think we're so far ahead in terms of our ability to launch a pivotal trial and demonstrate true safety and efficacy that it's simply, I follow the field, but I don't think it's practical in terms of the timeline for it to make an impact on what we need to. And so, if you will, I almost have a free pass from having to consider the tough ethics, but I am curious to your view on the fundamental ethical conundrum that this poses, because I know I would be somewhat uncomfortable as a chief medical officer. We're used to trying to prevent illness as the core of how we develop vaccines. So for me, this forces me to put people at risk along the way of developing a vaccine. It's just not how I'm wired. So it's tough for me really to envision.
Yeah. Well, I think your vaccine program and that of kind of a handful of others are advanced enough that it's not clear that you would accelerate that by doing human challenge studies. I think first it's important to acknowledge the courage of these volunteers. They're stepping up for the right reasons, and maybe it would make sense for some vaccines coming a little bit later, but just to be straight up, I don't think it's a good idea. I think that you're dealing with a disease that's potentially fatal. I know people say, well, young people don't die as frequently, but some do. We've seen many doctors and nurses in the prime of life die, and we've seen others, including celebrities. So there is some risk. And what's different here is there's no rescue. There's no antiviral available if somebody gets into deep trouble. And then if you think about a situation where maybe the vaccine is 80% effective, not bad, right? But that means 1 out of 5 of the volunteers is actually going to be infected and get the disease and suffer some of the consequences. And when you think of consequences, a principle here is informed consent for a volunteer. And it's pretty hard to have informed consent for something that we've only seen in humans for the last 6 months or 8 months, and we don't really know what the sequelae of the disease were. Originally, we thought it was just respiratory, now many other organs, even syndromes in children. And then one of the things I really worry about, and I know it's very low probability, is what if one of the volunteers in the early study actually dies? People say, well, what are the chances of that? Well, it can happen, and it did happen in gene therapy with Jesse Gelsinger. And the impact of that was not only the tragic loss of a life of an 18-year-old, but it set back gene therapy probably 2 decades. And the vaccine field has so much baggage in addition that if that kind of thing happened, I think it would be a real potential setback for the field. So, Tal, it's been great having this conversation with you. And I think it's time for us to open this up to the Q&A from the audience. So let me see what we have here. So one of the questions has to do with, do you think, basically the question is, do you think you're focused on antibodies? Do you think that's going to be enough here? Do we need the other arm of the immune system to cell-mediated immunity? Will that be important and are you looking at that for this vaccine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer is yes and yes. So let me expand on that for a second. I come from a field of T-cell immunology, not antibodies. Being in cancer immunology, we know that T-cells have curative potential in cancer, but antibodies likely do not, except maybe in the adjuvant setting. So we are looking at the ability to induce both antibodies and T-cells. In fact, the way the mRNA vaccine works, because it translates a protein from within our own cells, it is scientifically very likely, and indeed we've demonstrated it time and again, that we generate T-cells as well as antibodies. Now, that being said, it is pretty clear that antibodies are more straightforward and reliable to measure and likely correlate with the majority of the benefit. Now, why do I say that? Well, because people are doing experiments where they're just taking plasma from people who've been sick and giving it to people who recovered, what's called convalescent plasma, and they're giving it as a therapeutic to people who are now sick with the goal of ameliorating active disease. That tells you that the antibodies themselves, there's no T cells in that prep, the antibodies themselves can have therapeutic benefit. Similarly, companies are making recombinant antibodies, monoclonal antibodies. So this is just the antibody piece, and they're going to test whether that works both to prevent illness as well as to treat illness. So that tells you that likely as it relates to the ability to prevent disease, antibodies, I suspect, are going to be the important piece. The importance of T cells come as an adjunct and supportive to generating antibodies and maintaining their levels. And I think in that context, we're absolutely, I'm pretty positive that our vaccines all induce T cells, and we will be showing the T cell data when it emerges for our vaccine as well.
Great. A different question from the listeners has to do with animal safety testing. We're moving so quickly. We want to do everything we can to protect humans, people going into the clinical trials. What kind of animal safety data was accumulated? Was it rushed? And how much can you rely on animal safety, Tal, to predict what's going to happen in human subjects in a clinical trial?
So there's 2 questions there. Was it rushed? I don't think it was rushed for a very simple reason. FDA has seen enough of our animal safety data for other vaccines over the years, and that what they have come to expect for us while they let us start a phase 1 trial we very quickly demonstrated the requisite data in the preclinical models. In fact, I would say the opposite, given the understood expectation for speed here. There was a tremendous amount of investment early on in many preclinical animal models of several different species that have to do with both demonstrating safety as well as demonstrating the potential for benefit. And so far, and you'll see the data come out in the public literature, I think the first paper has already been posted online with mouse data. But so far, the data have all been in the right direction in the sense that we are seeing the ability to generate antibodies. We are not seeing any unexpected signs of toxicity or safety. And so it's all been very supportive to the data we're seeing coming from the early clinical trials.
Great. This next one is a really interesting question. We probably, both of us probably should have a crack at it. And it's, why should the ethics of particular population benefit play a role in vaccine development? Were ethics ever used for vaccine development? For instance, seasonal flu, polio, measles, etc. So we'll have to dig back a little in history. I have some thoughts, but Tal, do you have some thoughts about answering this one?
Let me answer it on the COVID, and then I'll defer to you to answer on the history, because I think you're much more erudite on that topic than I am.
And older.
I think the reason for a focus on special populations and why it's ethical, because I think when we think about the vaccine, we think about benefit risk. You know, there's not going to be a binary event where Sunday, some Monday morning, everybody wakes up and it's time to go to the CVS around the corner and get a vaccine. I think the vaccine should be made available first to those who need it the most, those who are more at risk of not just getting infected, but actually getting sick from being infected. And so in that regard, I think it is imperative that the trial and the way we study and understand the benefit risk allows us to mirror the eventual deployment and use. I'll take the other extreme, pediatrics. It's not clear. There clearly is a disease in children that is from COVID-19. It is much less prevalent in adults. It seems to be unique. We will need to develop the data in pediatrics as well to demonstrate that. But surely the starting place here is people who are older and have the well-described comorbid conditions. And so that's why we need to match what we do in development to the eventual ethical deployment as it relates to the benefit risk in any subpopulation. I'll defer to you for I think, the wider answer here.
Okay. Well, I think the question of whether ethics should play a role here, did they ever play one historically? My view is that ethics is a field like most other fields. It's evolving and it's changing and it's maturing. So if we go back to the very first early days of vaccines, British physician Edward Jenner went to the reason that he's credited with kind of inventing the concept of vaccines, even though others had done work in this area before them, was that he thought that cowpox might protect people from the current epidemic there of smallpox. And so to test this, Jenner grabbed the 8-year-old son of his gardener and injected him actually with cowpox, and then exposed him to smallpox, inoculated him with smallpox. Now, the ethics of that are, they don't hold up today. That would actually be criminal assault today if you did an experiment like that. So things have evolved. During the polio epidemic, there were ethical discussions about the oral versus the injected vaccine, the Sabin versus the Salk vaccine. One used live attenuated virus and one used a killed virus. And so there were worries about actually causing polio. But almost regardless of the history here, things have evolved so much and the situation is on such a scale that the ethical considerations like the ones that we are discussing today are extremely important, and I think we're obliged to examine them. Let's see what else has come in while we were talking about. Here's a more technical one, but I think it's one that many people are thinking about. And this one's really for you, Tal. Can you please comment on how vaccine development is planning to deal with mutations of the virus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to date, what we know about the mutations that have been described is that so far I have not seen the description of a mutation that would cause an immunological escape. What do I mean by that? We've not seen mutations that somebody who was previously infected and developed immunity would now get infected again because of a mutation. In other words, the mutations that have been described so far are typically point mutations that maybe allow a receptor to be different or shed different or behave biologically different, but to the immune system is still able to recognize that. In fact, the one mutation that's been the most described, that one that seems to improve infectivity, it seems that the total spike protein vaccine, and we have emerging data with our own, would generate an immune response that would see that mutation just as well as it would see the wild type, that is the unmutated one. Now, it's not, though, impossible that in the future there will be immunological escape in true mutations that the immune system wouldn't recognize. We've seen that with influenza, which tends to mutate more rapidly. I think the answer there is, this is where I think we will have an advantage with the platforms that are being developed today because they can respond rapidly. So if there is a mutation that emerges that is a SARS-CoV-3 that now somebody who's been infected with SARS-CoV-2 isn't immune to, it is, I would expect we would have the sequence of that and could rush into production massive amounts of a vaccine that would just now have the mutation and teach the immune system how to overcome that one. And because we will have demonstrated with this 30,000 subject trial, assuming that it works, that the platform can prevent disease, you wouldn't need to go run the 30,000 trials again. Just like for influenza every year, you don't run phase 3 trials afresh. You take a sequence, you put it on a proven platform, and you go vaccinate the population. So we will have built the capacity and we will have demonstrated the clinical and scientific data that would enable us in the future to react much quicker and much more effectively, I think, than the first time that we saw this SARS-CoV-2 this year.
Terrific. Well, I think it's time for us to bring our conversation to a close. Tal, it's been great to be with you and to be under the auspices of the Jerusalem Ethics Forum. We're both very grateful to the Cura Foundation and the Gallian Foundation and the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity for giving us a chance to talk about this topic that's on everyone's mind, the development of a vaccine. These foundations are trying to get leaders who are in medicine and science, who are in the trenches working on this together. And so it's been great to get your perspectives. For those of you who are interested in continuing this conversation, it will be continued on October 29th at the Gallian Foundation Summit. And that's the educational wing of the Prix Gallienne Award program. And there we're going to have 2 panels on COVID-19 treatments and vaccines, and I invite our listeners to join us there as well. So now with gratitude, I'm going to hand the microphone back to Robin Smith to conclude this program.
Dr. Rosenblatt and Dr. Zaks, we know how busy you both are and want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today for this timely and important conversation about the ethical considerations of developing a vaccine for COVID-19. And to our audience, the Cura Foundation and the Jerusalem Ethics Forum hope you found this conversation informative. We'll be sending you a questionnaire to get your feedback, so we hope you'll take the time to share your views with us. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you next time to continue discussing issues around ethical dilemmas in healthcare.